Welcome, and thank you for joining us here today in the studios. My name is Tammy Hughes, and I'm with Dr. Pat Heim, and we're going to be talking in this video about leadership, being a team player, and the different rules of talk. We know from working with organizations and executives all around the globe that one of the biggest ahas we hear from executives is that the different rules of talk really does play out inside of organizations. So Pat, I thought I'd ask you just right off the bat to tell us a little bit about how some of those differences in the rules of talk play out inside of organizations.
Well, men tend to live in a hierarchy and women tend to live in a flat culture, and men tend to have a goal focus in how they talk and women tend to have a process focus in how they talk. And that tends to affect who we hire and who we promote, because we tend to value people who are like us. If you want to understand some of the basic differences between men and women, the hierarchy versus the flat culture, the goal focus versus the process focus, you might want to visit our Power Dead Even video. It will be eye-opening in terms of the cultural differences between men and women.
Now explore with me leadership, because even leadership falls dramatically different when they study men and women. Here's what they have found. Neither style that men and women tend to use for leadership are right or wrong, good or bad. They're just different ways of leading. The problem is we tend to go on autopilot and we tend to lead with the style that we're most comfortable with rather than leading with the style that's most effective. So the trick is figuring out which leadership style is most effective in this situation. In the male culture, the leadership style that men tend to use is a style called command and control. Command and control works really well in a hierarchy. The person up here tells the person down here what to do, and the person down here does so unquestioningly. In a flat structure, the leadership style that's most often used is a style called involvement. And involvement works very well in a flat structure. It gets everybody involved in setting the direction for the group. So the trick here is using the style that's most effective and most appropriate rather than the one that I'm just most comfortable with. So let's talk about when each leadership style is most appropriate. Command and control is most appropriate in time-bound situations, emergencies, and when there are no alternatives. Involvement is most appropriate when you need creativity, psychological buy-in, and you need them to make it work. The trick here is using the style that's most appropriate, not just the style I'm most comfortable with, or the style I was born with, or the tool I use most often. Picking the one that's most appropriate. Someone asked us one time, are you suggesting that a football coach should use involvement? No. That's a classic time-bound situation. There's not time enough to get all the players over to the sidelines and say, what play do you think we ought to run next? Let's start with you and go around the huddle. That is a classic time-bound situation. Command and control is the most appropriate style to use in that situation. But the trick is using the style that's most appropriate rather than the style that I'm just more comfortable with. Now, the Center for Creative Leadership, which does fabulous research in the area of leadership, has found that one of the most important components for effective leadership is one must display some form of aggressiveness. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Research shows us that the bands of acceptable behavior are very broad for women in childhood. Women can behave when they are young in girly ways, playing dolls and house, and then go outside and play rough with the boys, and then go back inside and play dolls and house, and it's all seen as perfectly acceptable. But those bands become much more narrow for men in childhood. And if men get outside of these bands, they'll earn a little title that's not fun to wear, like pansy, sissy, girly boy, or gay. Those bands flip later in life, according to the research. The bands become very broad for men in adult life, specifically when they start to lead others. Men can lead in a very aggressive way, and then an evolving way, and then an aggressive way, and then an evolving way. And it's all seen as perfectly acceptable. But those bands become much more narrow for women in adult life when they start to lead others. And if they get outside of these bands and demonstrate too much aggressiveness in their leadership, they'll earn a little title. And it's not a fun one to wear. It rhymes with witch. So both men and women experience what the research calls as broad bands of acceptable behavior and narrow bands of acceptable behavior. They're just at different times in life. And here's why I think it's important for me to bring this up. I often hear women say, Tammy, it's not fair that I have to operate within narrower bands of being able to demonstrate leadership aggressiveness than my male peers can. And I always say, your male peers understand what that feels like because men experienced narrow bands of acceptable behavior in childhood. So let's talk about this displaying aggressiveness and how this can be tricky territory for women. Let me paint it with a story, a real life story. Years ago, we were having an election in the US. And during that election, one of our candidates was being drilled one time by a group of reporters. And the group of reporters were all men and one woman. And they were asking all the difficult questions during the session. And when he was done with the interview, he went to walk off the stage and they muted his mic appropriately. But when he got to the steps to go down the steps with a colleague, they accidentally unmuted the mic. And so we were able to hear him live when he said, "What was she doing? Trying to prove her manhood?" Well, this is what the research calls the double bind. If she wants to be part of that reporter group, she has to ask the difficult questions. But sometimes when women ask the difficult questions, they can get zapped with comments like, "What are you trying to do? Prove your manhood." So this is where this double bind exists for women in leadership that we don't see for the male culture. And so women ask all the time, "Tell me where the bands are. Just tell me where they are, and I'll behave myself in here." Well, that's the problem. The bands flex and move for variable reasons. In other words, the bands are in a different place in the UK than they are in Germany. Those bands are in a different place in the telecommunications industry than they are in the manufacturing industry. And those bands are in a different place inside of organizations depending on, are you on the HR side of the house or the sales side of the house? And those bands flex and move depending on who the leader is at the top. And so women will sometimes navigate through and figure out how to display suitable amounts of aggressiveness so they can lead and be followed without displaying too much aggressiveness, and people don't want to follow at all. And then the leadership will change at the top, and women will have to refigure out where those bands are. Now, a great example of a woman who is willing to try to figure out where the bands are. We encourage women to bump up against the bands once in a while to try to figure out where they are. There was a patent attorney at one of the big pharmaceutical companies, and she received a performance review that kind of surprised her once. She had gotten into a bit of a verbal exchange with government affairs over a new compound that was going to be released to drug. She got into the verbal exchange for the welfare of the organization. And she was receiving her performance review the next week. And she got the written performance review from her manager, who is the head of legal affairs for this big pharmaceutical company. And in her review, he wrote that she was unpolite. And she couldn't figure out why he said she was unpolite. So when she went in to have her face-to-face review with him, she sat down and she said to him, "Why did you put on my review that I'm unpolite?" And he said, "Because of that verbal exchange you got into with government affairs. You conducted yourself in an unpolite manner." And she looked at him and she said, "If I had been one of your male attorneys, would you have put that on my review?" And he said he didn't even think about it for half a second. He said, "No, I wouldn't." And he took it off. Now, I don't think for 1 second that the head of legal affairs for one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies on the planet has 2 different sets of rules about what he expects from his male attorneys and his female attorneys. But this is a classic example. When we look through the lens of our own gender culture, we can often misread and misjudge the other gender culture if we don't understand how both gender cultures work differently. Now, when we talk about this word aggressiveness, there was a study that looked at letters of referral that went with resume packets for high-level positions. They found that looking at letters of references, the word aggressiveness was always used to positively describe a man's qualifications for a job. And the word aggressiveness was never used to positively describe a woman's qualification for a job. So this is where we can find that there's some tricky territory for women in leadership trying to display suitable amounts of aggressiveness based on the culture. And that's why we need to talk about this as organizations, and especially as we think about shaping the organizations of our future. We need to make sure we understand how both cultures work differently. And there's one other rule I want to talk about in that story I gave you of the patent attorney, and that is the rule that says both men and women judge women by women's rules. Here's what that means. Not only will a woman see another woman leading in a very aggressive way, say, "Something's wrong with that." A man seeing a woman lead in an aggressive kind of way will say, "Something's wrong with that." And that's because both men and women judge women by women's rules. And in that particular case with the patent attorney, what he saw as unpolite coming from a female attorney wouldn't have been seen as unpolite coming from a male attorney. So we need to understand how both cultures work differently. So let's spend a few minutes and explore teams. We know from the research that mixed gender teams outperform smarter homogeneous teams, specifically in the area of change and creativity. In other words, what that means is that the gender diversity seems to trump the intellectual capital of the group. So let's talk a little bit about what being a team player means.
So Pat, even something as simple as being a team player can be defined differently based on which gender lens you wear. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, some time back, I was doing a team building session with executives at a bank. These were the top executives of this bank. And I had asked them to list personally what it meant to be a team player. And then I went around and I went over their lists. And I went to the first individual, let's call him Bill, and his list said to follow orders, to support unquestioningly, and do what needs to be done even if you don't want to. So then we went to the next person, we'll call her Melinda, and her list said to share ideas, to listen to each other, particularly when we disagree, and to work together collaboratively. So then I went back to him and I said, how does her list strike you? And he said, manipulative. I went to her and I said, how does his list strike you? And she said, mindless. Now, we throw around the word team player all the time. And we think we mean the same thing, but we don't. As he saw it, being a good team player means playing your slot in the hierarchy well, without question. To her, being a good team player means helping out anybody on this flat field at any time without question. So what happens is we point the finger at the other gender and we say, you're not being a good team player. Well, you're not being a good team player. Well, you're not being a good team player. But the problem is we define it differently and we don't know that we define it differently. So now when I work with teams, I will not let them use the word team player unless they define it.
Well, let's talk about who's more likely to use friendship or friendliness in the workspace. Men are more likely in the workspace to use more of what's called friendliness. Friendliness comes and goes as necessary. Women tend to use in the workspace more friendships. If you're my friend at work, you're my friend at home, you're my friend if I see you in the marketplace. Now, friendship and friendliness does not suggest for the male culture that men are not capable of deep, meaningful friendships. Men absolutely are. But men are more likely to use friendliness in the workspace. Let me talk about how friendliness and friendship can play out differently in a meeting. A man and a woman in a meeting, and she brings up her great idea in the meeting. And he attacks her idea and talks about all the reasons it would never work in this industry. When they walk out of the meeting, he turns to her and says, "Don't take it personally." Well, this makes no sense to her. In the male culture, friendliness means we go into the meeting, we have the scrimmage, we scuff around the ideas, and then when we get out of the meeting, the relationship, just like a rubber band, bounces right back to where it was before. Not in the female culture. She will often walk away from that experience and feel like she can't trust him. So even something as simple as how men and women do friendliness and friendship in the workplace plays out very differently. Now let's talk about the actual meeting. Let's talk about how men and women do meetings differently, some of those different styles. First of all, most men expect that the real meeting is going to occur before the meeting, during the break, and after the meeting. Most women come into meetings expecting that the real meeting is going to occur in the meeting. And it's almost like the signals have gotten mixed up between the male and female culture. Now, the point of this research is not where is the right place to have the meeting. You can have the meeting before the meeting, during the break, and after the meeting, or you can have the meeting in the meeting. The point is to make the location of the meeting overt, so everybody knows where the real meeting is going to occur. That way everybody has an opportunity to have what's called informal influence in those decisions that are made in the meeting space. So make the decision overt so everybody knows. Now I do have two cautions of where we should not have the meeting. The first one's the most obvious, never in the washroom. The next place not to have your meeting is not to have your meeting after work hours too often. Here's my point. If the real meeting happens at the pub most nights, we know from research that by domestic duty alone, you may exclude some segment of your population. There was a research study that was done looking at partners, married partners, who were the same grade level. In other words, they earned the same sort of income or they had the same grade level. They didn't work for the same companies, but they were basically peers from a career perspective. Women accounted for almost 70% of the domestic duties. So that means if the real meeting is going to occur at the bar or the pub most nights, by domestic duty alone, you may be excluding one segment of your population. So make sure that the meeting happens during the work hours most of the time. Once in a while, after hours is fine, but it can't be that the real informal decisions are always made after work hours. And one other thing to say too, oftentimes when we talk with executive women, they will say things like, I just hate going to those team building events where they go to football games or they go out for a golfing event. I hate those. I never go on those. Our coaching is, if that's where the real meeting is going to occur, you need to be there sometimes as well. So the coaching goes both directions when we think about where and how we're going to have our meetings. Now let's talk about what the research shows us that men and women tend to do differently in meetings. We know that in meetings, men tend to account for more of the air time. Women tend to speak more briefly in meetings, which means that men tend to use more words in meeting space than women do. And this ought to create some confusion for you, because when we talked about processing, we talked about that sometimes takes more words in the workspace. But there seems to be a rule that overlays when it gets into meeting space for the female culture. And that is the word share. Share. Women are taught in childhood to share. And so a woman is more likely to get into a meeting and say, okay, there's 5 of us here. I'll use about 20% of the airtime and then be quiet. So she doesn't look like an air hog. So she often will point the finger at the male culture and say, always bringing up his ideas and taking all the airspace, and he will often point at her and say, doesn't have any great ideas to bring up. Now here's the trick. In the male culture, if you are passionate about your idea and you believe in your idea, one of the ways you demonstrate that passion is by bringing your idea up again and again and again as a way of demonstrating you're passionate about your ideas. But women often in the female culture use that share time, and that oftentimes will look as if she doesn't contribute ideas. By the way, one of the common things we see on performance review research is that there's a phrase that shows up in women's performance appraisals that does not show up in men's. And that is the phrase, she does not speak up in the meetings. And we have to ask through the lens of which culture? Through the lens of the culture that says if you believe in your idea, you bring your idea up again and again and again as a way of showing you're passionate about your idea? Or through the lens of the culture that says, take your fair share and then be quiet. Men are more likely to bring their ideas up as a declamatory voice. Obviously, the best way to do this would be. And women are more likely to bring up their ideas phrased as questions. Well, don't you think it'd be a great idea if? So she sounds like a curious woman rather than a woman with ideas. Some of the other things that we find in meeting research is that men tend to account for more interruptions, and women tend to wait their turn. In fact, women will often say, I was waiting for the turn in the meeting that never came. So sometimes even the signals get mixed up on airtime and who's using the airspace. Now, another thing that happens in meetings is oftentimes you will find that men account for more interruptions than women do. In fact, it's a really high percentage of the interruptions that occur from the male culture. And if you study little boys growing up, little boys do a lot of what's called verbal climbing. One boy speaks, another boy speaks over top of him, another boy speaks over top of him, another boy speaks over top of him. Yeah. If you study little girls on schoolyards, girls are often doing what's called turn taking. She speaks, she be quiet. 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 Women are sometimes waiting for the turn that never comes. So here's my tip for you. Whether you are in the middle of the bell curve for women or the tails of the bell curve for men, if you feel you are in meetings frequently and getting interrupted, and you don't ever feel like you get to get your whole idea out there, here's our communication tip for you. Go into the tunnel and just keep talking. Even if another voice comes in to interrupt you, just keep talking. And this can be very uncomfortable in the female culture to talk while someone else is talking, but just keep talking. Do not make eye contact with the interrupter, because eye contact often signals to the interrupter, you can have the floor. So just keep talking if this particular piece of the research creates problems with interruptions, feeling like you don't get your ideas on the table. And then finally, sometimes the being influenced in public, we find in the male culture that it's very functional to resist being influenced, particularly in public. And women do something in meetings that is called smile more. It's called the silent applause. Women smile more in meetings. Yeah, and sometimes men will see this smile and assume she's agreeing with my idea, when in reality, it might just be her face. Women use more facial nerves. They do a lot more what's called face work. So she may not be intentionally smiling at your idea. That just might be her face. So let's explore the different ways that men and women speak differently, the different rules of talk. Men and women grow up in the same families, eating the same food, sitting by each other in classrooms, how could men and women even learn to speak differently? Well, let's explore 3 of the fundamental ways that we know speech is different, fundamentally in communication style as well as in linguistics. This first piece of research, this is how they conduct the research. They go to a big group of men and women and they say, new project coming down the line. If we were to give you this project, what would you do with it? How a man is more likely to answer that question. Well, we could do A. If A doesn't work, we'll do B. If B doesn't work, we'll do C. Clearly. Go to the women. New project coming down the line. If we were to give you this project, what would you do with it? How a woman is more likely to answer that question. Wow, I've never seen anything quite like that before. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure. I suppose we could try A. I don't know that A is going to work. I suppose we could try B. I don't think we've got money in the budget. I suppose we could try C, but I don't think we have time enough to do C. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure. Now, why would men and women answer this question differently? For men, the research calls this activity making it up. I'll tell them I can do it and then see if I can go figure out how to do it. For women, this is an issue of going into the confessional, according to the research. Before I feel comfortable telling you all of my ideas, I want to make sure you'd understand everything I don't know. And only when I feel comfortable that you know everything I don't know, will I feel comfortable telling you what I do know. Now, why would men and women do this differently? For men, this is an issue of risk. I'll tell them I can do it and then see if I can go figure out how to do it. For women, this is an issue of honesty. You're looking at buying me. I want to make sure you'd know right up front what you'd be getting if you were buying me. But the question is, who are you more likely to select? They went around to universities around the globe and they looked at MBA applications. Most MBA applicants are asked to write an essay describing their future. Most men begin their essays with, I will. Most women begin their essays with, I hope to, or I would like to. Now, you're on the MBA application search committee. Who are you going to pick? The one who will do it or the one who hopes to do it? The research says he made that up and she went into the confessional. Risk-taking, honesty. Risk-taking, honesty. If you think about a male culture living in a hierarchy, risk-taking makes a lot of sense. If you think about living in a flat structure, honesty makes a lot of sense. Now, here's the trick. They're not parallel opposites. What happens is oftentimes we tend to point the finger across the gender culture. Women look at men and say, that's not being very honest. Men look at women and say, take a few risks around here. Well, they fall in completely separate categorical buckets. There was even a piece of research that just came out last year looking at people who put their name in for a promotion. Men are more likely to put their name in for a promotion if they feel they have 6 of the 10 qualifications required for the job. Women are more likely to put their name in for the promotion if they feel they have 10 of the 10 qualifications for a job. Risk-taking and honesty. Now let's explore some of the linguistic differences between the male and female culture. And let's visit the female culture first. In the female culture, women use a lot in their speech of tools called hedges, disclaimers, and tag questions. These are linguistic tools that women use in their speech. And when women use these, here's what they sound like. Disclaimers are little phrases put at the beginning of a sentence, like, I don't know about this might not be such a good idea. Hedges are words like kinda, sorta, maybe, try. And tag questions are little phrases put at the end of a sentence like, you know, and okay. And when women use hedges, disclaimers, and tag questions in their linguistics, it sometimes sounds like she maybe doesn't know what she sorta is talking about, sorta. Men often hear these linguistic tools differently than they were intended. Now, why would women use these hedges, disclaimers, and tag questions in a flat structure? If one woman goes up to another woman and says, we will be doing this tomorrow and you will be doing it in that way, that looks kind of bossy. So a woman is more likely to flatten that out linguistically by saying something like, I was kind of thinking about doing this tomorrow, Sarah. What do you think? Huh. And that way she's linguistically included the other woman in the direction. So it works very well in the female culture, but it can be misread across cultures. Now let's explore what men have in their culture that we don't see women using much in their speech. It's called verbal bantering. Verbal bantering is defined as healthy bonding behavior. Very functional in the male culture. You see little boys practice this behavior growing up. One boy will go up to his friend and say, "You look like a frog." And then he'll go to his other friend and he'll say, "You look like a Tyrannosaurus Rex." This means I like you. You're my friend. You don't see little girls practicing this behavior. You don't see a little girl go up to a friend and say, "Hi, Sarah, you look like a frog today." It wouldn't enhance the relationship, but it works really well in the male culture. So boys grow up and get into the workplace, and verbal bantering is still very important in the workspace, and it sounds something like this. "Hey there, Tom, nice suit. What'd you do, sleep in that thing last night?" And it's that healthy bonding that men do with other men. Dr. Pat Heim was on a flight some years ago, and she was headed somewhere on a speaking assignment. And she sat down in the airplane next to a man who was dressed in a uniform for that airline. And she looked at him and said, "Are you a pilot?" And he looked back at her and he said, "No, my mother just dresses me this way." And she had a split screen reaction. Part of her, the female culture, said, "Oh, it's not very nice to say that. I was asking an honest question." And then the other side of her, understanding the male culture, said, "It's verbal bantering. I get to practice it sitting right here in the airplane seat." So she leaned across to him and said from her other side, not her real side, she said, "I know this may surprise you, but I can't tell the difference in my gate agents, flight attendants, and pilots. I'm sure you're wearing something that's very important to you, but I haven't a clue what it is." Oh, that felt so vicious for her to say. But he took his hat off and took a tour of his hat, and they became friends. Verbal bantering makes a lot of sense in the male culture. Using hedges, disclaimers, and tag questions to keep that speech flat makes a lot of sense in the female culture. Now let's talk about the last communication difference between this male and female culture, and that is the comfort level with which men and women speak about succeeding and failing. Even this falls dramatically by gender. They've been running this attribution theory around the globe for many, many years, and the results have always fallen dramatically by gender. In fact, they've even run this study on children of all ages, and the results fall exactly the same. Here's how they run the study. They get a big room, and they fill it with a wide variety of people, usually 200 to 250 participants. They give them a thing to do, some task, and then they arbitrarily divide the room in half, and they go give bogus results. They tell this half of the room, "Oh, you did particularly well," and ask them why. They go to this half of the room and they go, "Oh, you did particularly poorly," and ask them why. When men were asked why they did particularly well, they tended to attribute it to factors inside themselves. "You asked me to do it, didn't you?" When women were asked why they did particularly well, they attribute it to 3 factors: effort, task ease, or luck. I tried real hard, it wasn't so hard to begin with, or I got lucky. When men were asked why they did particularly poorly, they attribute it to factors outside themselves. "I tried, you didn't give me enough time, the instructions weren't clear." When women were asked why they did particularly poorly, they attribute it to factors inside themselves. "I tried, I just couldn't do it." And I want you to get these dynamics. When men succeed, they tend to point in. When women succeed, they tend to point out. When men fail, they tend to point out. When women fail, they tend to point in. And someone sent us a cartoon once that recapped this particular attribution theory so well. It's 2 frames, and I'm going to act them out for you just real quickly. The first frame is of a woman, and she's standing in front of a full-length mirror trying to get her pants zipped up. And her caption reads, "I gotta go on a diet." Next caption is of a man, and he's standing in front of a full-length mirror trying to get his pants zipped up. And his caption reads, "Something's wrong with these pants." So I want you to watch where you point the finger when you tend to succeed and fail, because we know from lots of research that there's a different comfort level in pointing out and in for both success and failure. There was an executive in one of our recent sessions who talked to me after the session was over. And he said, "Tammy, I wish I would have known this information before today." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I run sales for our organization, and we were looking to replace one of our sales leaders. And I had a woman who had been recommended to me by several peers. She came very highly recommended, so I interviewed her. During the interview, I asked her to tell me about her successes. And she told me all about all the great teams that she had been on that had been very successful. And I looked at her several times during the interview and I said, "I don't want to hear about your teams being successful. I want to hear about your successes." And he said, "After reviewing this material, I realized that physically her face actually kind of changed and became uncomfortable while she talked about her successes." He said, "I chose to not hire her." And he said, "After hearing this information today, I'm quite certain that I chose not to hire her because I didn't think she spoke very confidently about her successes." He said, "I wish I would have known these differences because the person I did hire spoke quite well of his successes." So even in how men and women feel comfortable talking about succeeding and failing can be radically different. And I want you to think about where this plays out inside of your organization. Everything from interviews, performance reviews, promoting. Think about how the comfort level with talking about succeeding and failing can be very different based on the gender cultures. So let's explore now some of the differences between the male and female culture when we talk about nonverbals, things that men and women do differently with their faces and their bodies. There's even things that men and women do differently with their face. Right now what I'm doing is called nodding. Yes, even something as simple as a nod can mean different things depending on the gender cultures. For most men, this nod means "I agree with you." For most women, this nod means "I hear you, you've got the floor, keep on going." This does not necessarily mean "I agree with you." So here's what will happen. Bob and Barbara will be walking down the hallway. And Bob will stop Barbara in the hallway to talk about the great idea he's going to bring up at this afternoon's meeting. And the whole time he is talking to Barbara, she is nodding away that he's reading that as agreement. When in reality, she might just be saying, "I hear what you have to say, keep on talking." They leave that engagement and get into the meeting that afternoon. And he brings up his great idea that he worked with her already in the hallway and finds out that she's the first to disagree with his idea. And the executives are present in the meeting. And he says, "She turned on me. She agreed with me in the hallway, and now that the executives are here, she's disagreeing," without realizing that he may have misread her nod as agreement. Now, I know you work on multicultural teams all over the place, and I want you to know that this research does not work in most parts of India and in a couple places in Asia, but everywhere else the nod research seems to resonate, and that is that men and women nod even for different reasons. Now let's talk about another nonverbal difference that we find between the male and female culture, and that is the cues in reading facial expressions. We know there's a big difference in the ability to give and read nonverbal expressions. So let's go back to some of that PET scan research and see what it has to say about nonverbal differences. What they do is they put men and women in the PET scan and they show them a series of cue cards with emotions or with facial expressions, and they ask them to tell them what the emotion is on the facial expression. So everything from angry, sad, disgusted, that sort of thing. When women are in the scanner doing this task, there's very small parts of the brain that light up red. Put men in the scanner and give them the same series of cue cards and ask them to identify the emotion in the cue card. Whole brain typically turns red, and they don't always get the answers right. So there's a big difference in nonverbal sensitivity between men and women. And so here's what I coach when we talk with women about this. If you're upset with something that your male colleague has done, you can't just put your face on that says there's something wrong. Your female colleague will read that nonverbal expression, but you're going to need to put some language on it so that your male colleague can read that facial expression. Now let's talk about body orientation. There's even research that shows that men and women prefer to stand in different places in the workspace. When they watched children playing with the variety of toys, they found that boys and girls tended to play in different locations as well. Boys tended to pick up toys and play shoulder to shoulder and play like this. Girls most often picked up toys and sat or stood face to face and played like this. That doesn't change all that much in the workplace. We know from body orientation research that men are most comfortable in the workspace standing or sitting shoulder to shoulder and talking out here. Women are more comfortable in the workplace standing or sitting face to face and talking out here. Now here's how this can become a problem. Bob and Barbara are walking down the hallway, and Barbara stops Bob to talk about the ideas she's got for their team. And while she's talking to Bob, this doesn't feel very comfortable to him. And so he decides to flip to what's a more comfortable body orientation, and she thinks, he's just tuned me out. He's not listening to anything I have to say. He's just watching people walk up and down the hallway. Without realizing he may be hearing everything she has to say, he's just flipped to what's a more comfortable body orientation. Well, what often happens is this doesn't feel good to Barbara. So Barbara decides she wants to fix it. So she tries to come around and get back in the front in Bob's face. And this doesn't feel comfortable to Bob, so he adjusts just a little bit more. And Bob walks away from this engagement, and he thinks, and he doesn't even know why he thinks it, but he thinks, what an aggressive woman. And that is because the most aggressive posture for two men is facing each other in the workplace, hands on hips. So my tip for you is wherever you might find yourself in this particular scenario, stay planted. Because there's too great a risk that the other person might misread your adjustment.
So Pat, I remember a story you told years ago about a female executive inside of a big organization who had been coined a woman with a lot of problems.
Yeah. This was a consumer products company, and she had been promoted into a position of, she was a director of research in this particular chunk of the organization. And in this position, she was allowed to meet with the high mucky mucks for an hour a month. So what she decided would be a good idea in terms of the organization is before the meeting with the high mucky mucks, she would go to her researchers and she would say, give me your gnarliest problems. Because I have an hour with these big shots, and maybe they can help us with these problems. And so every month she would take the gnarliest problems and she would meet with the high mucky mucks for an hour to solve the problems. She realized after doing this for numerous months that she was getting a reputation as a woman with a lot of problems, because all of her peers happened to be male, did not do this. What they did is they would take their accomplishments for the month and they would present their accomplishments, i.e. hierarchy stuff, present their accomplishments for the month to the high mucky mucks. Well, she was trying to do what was best for the organization in her mind, solving problems for the organization, but that's not what these high mucky mucks, of course all male, what they saw is they saw a woman with a lot of problems. And it was really unfortunate because she was getting a reputation as a problem person, and here they had finally promoted a woman into director of research, and she wasn't going to make it. And so, she asked me what I thought, and I said, well, obviously you have to shift and compete with your male peers and present your accomplishments. And was that the best for the organization?
No.
Yeah.
They lost their strengths.
Yeah.
You know, what men and women do makes perfect sense given the cultures that they come from. And the most savvy leaders are the leaders that understand how both gender cultures work differently. Not necessarily good or bad, not right or wrong, just differently. And we want to capitalize on those differences. We don't want to tell anybody in our organization that they need to come to work and be somebody that they're not, because we know that retention is a problem. And I ask the question, why would we do that anyway? We would be sacrificing the very rich diversity that we hired. That rich diversity, which is our competitive advantage. Let me wrap our time up together with one of our old slogans that we have used over the years. It's all just chopsticks and silverware. Whatever you grew up with seems obviously, intrinsically, the right way to see things. If you grew up with silverware, watching people pick their food up with sticks looks pretty weird. But if you grew up with chopsticks, watching people stab and saw their food at the table looks equally problematic. It's just a matter of what seems usual to us. I hope that you go forth and you enjoy the differences. You talk about the differences because we want to appreciate, value, and preserve the differences. Thank you very much.